topic of Western civilization is very topical at the moment because it is indeed something that will be raised in the political and public arena as we move forward to the elections, and in particular, as we look at the role of the family and freedom and faith as it applies to our daily lives. So John, our guest tonight is John Anderson, the Honourable John Anderson AO. And John, I might just introduce you formally because it's a pity we can't see. But look, let's just have a look at what you've done. John Anderson is a farmer, a grazier from New South Wales. He spent around about 19 years from 1989 in the Australian Parliament. He served as a senior cabinet minister in the reformist government led by John Howard from 1996 to 2005. And I was pleased to be able to spend time with you with John Howard during some of those years, John. You served as the 11th Deputy Prime Minister of Australia and leader of the National Party from 1999 to 2005 in one of the most successful and reformist governments in Australia's parliamentary history. So, John, that's the way I think people are sort of remembering you. And I've noticed also, John, that you have written a book called Faith and Duty, which is a very interesting read, and I recommend it to anybody if you haven't read it. So I'll come back to that, John. But what I'd like to do is sort of hand over to you to talk about how Western civilization has an impact on family, freedom and faith, as you see it in the political sphere, in the social sphere, education-wise, family-wise. So, John, can I hand over to you and let us hear what you've got to say for about 20 minutes, and then we've got a whole host of questions that we're going to ask, John. Over to you.
Well, Greg, thank you very much. And I'm coming to you from North-West New South Wales, where we've had very bad storms, so we've had trouble with connections all the way through. The whole concept of Western civilization at the moment is a fraught one. And the culture has moved to a place where, in essence, we no longer believe in our own belief system, nor the values that it drove. And because we don't apply the values that those beliefs drove, I think we have a real problem with finding a basis for ethical and honest behavior, or for integrity, if you like, because there is a continuum. People often say that government is downstream of culture, but culture is downstream of beliefs. And the problem for the West is that in the great luxury that so many of us have lived in for so long, I think we have become indulgent, frankly. I think we've become sloppy in our thinking. We have allowed, as Christians, a weakness in our defense of core beliefs to take hold, such that basically every major tenet of our faith is now essentially discredited, or indeed turned on its head. The numbers are all there. You can see them in the collapse in the marriage rate, in the collapse of marriages that actually take place, in the number of children that are now born outside of marriage, and in the massive decline in fertility in the Western world. For a short period of time, in northern Italy, more women were not having children than did. The birth rate had fallen to 0.7 of 1%, or 0.7, whereas replacement rate is a little over 2.1 children per woman. In essence, it reflects an enormous actualization, a process of looking to inward rather than outward for identity, a culture which says not only should you think of yourself as the center of your own universe, but even the center of the universe. Truth for you is truth. Whatever you believe is real for you, is real for you. We're in danger of becoming, as Ayaan Hirsi Ali puts it, an emocracy rather than a democracy. because we increasingly confuse feeling with thinking. As Thomas Sowell puts it, the problem is not that little Johnny can't think, he can think. The problem is not that little Johnny can't feel, he can certainly feel. The problem is that little Johnny thinks feeling is thinking. And so given that we've built into our culture the idea that we can ignore any reference to external reference points, if you like, that we must find ourselves from within, given that we are not big enough to support our own model of God, if you like, we can't be God to ourselves, we're not up to the task, we have to engage in all sorts of, it seems to me, emotional rationalizations, which often are in denial of reality, in denial of observable facts. So when I was young, there were certain things that were known. There's never any doubt for me about my gender. That was at an earlier age. I don't want to be insensitive on that issue, but it's not something that I spent long periods of time agonizing over because it had never been suggested to me that I could be anything else. And again, I don't want to be insensitive on that, but it's a pretty big one. A very prominent and educated lady in Sydney the other day, her son came home. I can't reveal too much of these details, but and said, "Mummy, am I a boy or a girl?" And the mother replied, "I can't tell you that. You must decide for yourself." It's a big issue to have to decide without any sort of guidance from outside, I would put it to you. But over and beyond that, I knew other things. I knew that I, had a father, I had a mother, I came from a farming background. I had to go to school when I was 5. Well, I didn't go to school when I was 5. I did correspondence, and after that, I would have to go to school and then to boarding. There were a whole heap of things that were known. And my identity in many ways was settled, even though I had a lot of issues as it was to work through what I believed and what I thought and what my worldview, that's a term we're not using much more anyway, would be. My point is that we've now created an environment where I think it's unbelievably hard for young people to find an identity. So there's an enormous emphasis now on identity. What does it mean? And increasingly, we live in an age where the old Greco-Roman, no, I've forgotten who it was now. Was it Socrates? I think, therefore I am. Yeah. It's now I feel, therefore I am. And so in the midst of all of this, I suppose it becomes unbelievably challenging if somebody challenges my version of who I am. You cannot pay someone a greater insult. There can be no crueler put down than to suggest to somebody that you doubt their identity as they have defined it for themselves, even if it's still a work in progress and they're agonizing over it. And I think tied to that is the idea that mental health is a huge issue. And as you know, we now have this sort of extraordinarily big problem with so-called identity politics. In an age when all the emphasis is on the individual, we've lost this concept of community. G.K. Chesterton said something, the great Catholic thinker and brilliant writer, who, by the way, was known for getting on very well with people that he disagreed with. He and George Bernard Shaw were absolute opposites on everything. Absolute. One was a devout Christian, one was an atheist, et cetera, and it started from there. But they always looked forward to one another's company. And Chesterton said something to the effect that the good book has told us how to order our society if we want it to work. He's told us to love our neighbours as ourselves and to love our enemies, and that often they're the same people. And so there's a real challenge. You've got a neighbour, often your enemy, and you're commanded to love them as you love yourself. We've abandoned that. As we have sought to find our identity in terms of ourselves rather than by referencing ourselves across a community, it seems to me that we then find we're reverting to tribalism. That's the neatest way of describing what identity politics is. We need to find others like us to reinforce our position, make us feel good about ourselves, and then we go and hunt the enemy, who's anyone who disagrees with us. And as part of this, we've also detached virtue from character in another person. So once the Greco-Roman, the Aristotelian virtues, which briefly speaking, are justice, prudence, which means making wise decisions. It doesn't mean saying no or being cautious. It means making wise decisions with all the best available information, the facts, and an awareness of what facts are not known, the unknown unknowns, as Rumsfeld might have put it. It's justice temperance and moderation. And then there are the Christian virtues of love, faith, and hope. And we used to look at another person, even if we disagreed with them, and assess their character, at least in theory, by how they measured up to those qualities. So as a former National Party member of the Parliament, I might have looked at, and I did as a matter of fact, somebody on the other side who was a left-wing member of the Labor Party. And I thought to myself, here's a thoughtful person, a person committed to justice. He's temperate, he's moderate, he's quite a loving person, quite a giving person. I rate him highly in terms of virtue. Now the argument would be, how dare you disagree with me on climate change? You are not a virtuous person. My position is virtuous, but yours is not, and you should not be heard. This is a very profound shift. And I think the way that I would describe the danger would be to say that identity politics is in fact the norm in human societies. The garden in the jungle that was so exceptional was to be found in the great democracies, where this unique view of the individual arose. The worth and dignity of people, even if I disagreed with them, was such that I had to respect them. Our own former Prime Minister, our longest serving Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, commented once that democracy is more a spirit than it is a machine, in which we recognize that no matter our different stations in life, our different abilities, our different capabilities, all souls are equal in the eyes of heaven. Now, he wasn't on with this latest sort of critical theory idea that we all had to have equal outcomes. Far from it. He was acknowledging that will never happen. But he was making a much more profound point, that just because I might have an ability, Greg, that you don't, and you have many that I don't, many that I don't, neither of us can look down on the other, because a higher authority has said, hey, don't you be on yourself. As far as I'm concerned, you are both of equal merit. I found that very valuable in politics. I remember a very ugly situation in one of my country towns where the racial divisions were horrendous, being spat on and being told some very, very blunt things. And I remember consciously pulling myself up in my mind and saying, no, don't react. In some ways, this man's got a right to be angry and frustrated. He's expressing it entirely inappropriately, but in the eyes of a higher authority, his soul is worth as much as mine. So be careful how you respond, and do it out of love rather than out of vengeance. So what is now happening, as I see it with identity politics, is this. We are allowing weeds to choke out the garden of freedom that we've found, at the same time as the jungle encroaches. What am I saying? We are eating ourselves out from within culturally. The weeds are growing in the garden. At the same time as the jungle, right as we speak now, the emerging standoff between the authoritarian regimes, who are now displaying a deeply concerning sense of team-like approach to life, and us slowly getting our act together a little more than I might have expected, which I'm relieved about, but nonetheless massively weakened. Weakened to the point where we've been unrealistic about what's happening in the world, about the way we've been weakening ourselves and what have you. Coupled with this, though, is this horrendously intellectually flimsy concept of critical theory, or the social justice, capital S, capital J movement, that's flowed into the vacuum that's been left. It's best known for critical race theory, which is essentially that whites are all racist and only whites are racist. And if you're a male, you're particularly an oppressive racist. And it's self-evident, you see, because it's really important to remember that the critical theory movement rejects all major religions, all major political thought structures, including the Marxism which spawned it. It's anti-science, and we see a lot of anti-science stuff now amongst the politically correct, and it is anti-modernist. And its justification, if you like, is to say, well, look at the raw numbers. All the positions that matter are overwhelmingly dominated by whites, and even more so by white males. Therefore, we must revert to the idea that justice is to be found in correcting that and pursuing opportunity of outcome. It's unbelievably dangerous because it's a short road, much shorter than people realize, to totalitarianism. And again, it flows into a vacuum where there's a vacuum of historical knowledge. There's already a distaste for the institutions of our society and the values and the beliefs that were responsible for building them. And at the same time, young people burn with moral fervor. They always do. That's admirable. But unless your conscience is well informed, unless your mind has been filled with data, unless you understand that history is important but unbelievably nuanced, there are no shortcuts to understanding the lessons from history, you become a victim for all of this sort of bad thinking. So I think Alan Tudge was on to something. I wish he was still the education minister. I say that quite freely. When he said that we face a real problem. Our children now are being taught to despise their own culture, so they don't want to defend it. Frank Ferruti made the same point. He's emeritus of professor of philosophy, I think, at Kent University. He must be late 70s now, but he comes to Australia often. He wrote a very perceptive piece about the attempts by progressives to move Australia Day. And he said it's the same part and parcel of the same movement as the destaturing stuff. It looks like an attack on history, but actually it's an attack on our culture. So that our young people believe that they're being handed, as he put it, a nightmarish inheritance that is not worth defending. So we are at a dangerous point, but suddenly the opportunity to say to people, look, let's rethink all of this is presented by the horrors of what is now happening in Europe. I've talked for far too long. They're just some general headline thoughts. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, John. Look, what I'm going to do quickly is I'd like to share the screen with you for a moment. And now you would have seen these headlines. Universities walk away from Western civilization degree. Of course, the Australian National University refused to take the Ramsay Centre's donation. Likewise, Sydney University academics denounced Western civilization degree.
Without knowing what it was.
And the ANU says it's all about academic freedom. But I'm pleased to say that the offer that Ramsay made to all the universities nationally, only 3 universities, John, have taken this up. And that's the University of Wollongong, University of Queensland, and the ACU, the Australian Catholic University. Now, interestingly, all that means that what the newspapers are saying, Christian and Western heritage elevated in revised national curriculum, which is really good news. And you alluded to this, John, in the sense that Alan Tudge was right there. You know, we're getting back to the stage of having Western civilization, Christian heritage back in the curriculum. My question to you, John, why do you think that there is so much animosity by the higher education universities to having a course on Western civilization, which really is our true foundation, John?
I think that the reality is that this has been quite deliberate. The long march through the institutions has been very real. I think it goes back to the 1920s and the Frankfurt School of Thought, which was essentially based around the idea that we wanted to accelerate the communist revolution. It was obvious the proletariat, the working classes, were not going to rise up the way Marx had said they would. In fact, they didn't in Russia. Here's the interesting thing. And the question was asked, well, what's stopping the collapse of these dreadful, rotten, miserable Western cultures? It's the institutions, it's family, it's church, it's the legal system, it's the parliaments. We've got to erode confidence in them, destroy them, and then we'll get the communist revolution that we want. There's a very valuable paper written on this by Rob Smith from Moore College called Cultural Marxism. And he says we shouldn't shy away from using the term because they used it themselves.
Yeah.
And then you had the Gramsci school of thought, coming out of Italy in the 1930s, picked up very much by American academia and the whole love movement of the 1970s. And I touched on this being a very indulgent age. It's always struck me that if you think of the student rights in 1968 in particular in Paris, they were all middle-class kids who'd never had it so good, convinced that their own culture was rotten and should be overturned. As I say, we've got a powerful reminder now of what the real alternative looks like. And I hope it's very sobering. So I think those are the sorts of reasons. I think it's very, very sad. I think though that in many ways, frankly, what's happening is people thinking people everywhere, including young people, they're going online now to try and learn a bit more about, truth, if you like. And Jordan Peterson makes this point.
Yeah.
So if you want to win an argument today, don't try and do it through the mainstream media. No. They've been so degraded. There are exceptions. But if you really want to mount an argument these days, you go online. And if you want to learn, you go online.
I have a question that was emailed to me by Barry, and he asked a question that you've just touched on. How can we oppose the progressive paganisation of our nation via the increased promotion of the ideology such as Black Lives Matter, the cancel culture, the wokeism? How do we actually oppose it, John? Do we do it we can't do it through the media, as you've just alluded to? What would be the best way to oppose this paganisation of our culture?
Well, I think there's a lot of opposition coming. I really do. There's so much quality stuff now on the net and so many people sort of joining in the debate. Plus the reality that I think, Middle Australia, it's in a different place. And I suspect Middle America's in a different place. They're watching this culture war going on over their heads and they've really had enough of it. So, what I didn't say about the universities, they need to watch out because the taxpayers are going to get very tired of funding them, as they are of the ABC, for undermining our essential values. And if you take the ABC for a moment, I was stunned to see some work that was done by the Page Research Foundation that found that rural Australians are very cynical now about the ABC. They actually would like it to work, but they think its views are ultima-driven, and they don't particularly trust it. And increasingly now they look for other places to get their information. It shouldn't have come to this, but maybe the best parallel for it is the advent of the printing presses. It was very disruptive. And we have to be honest and say that there was a lot of cruelty that flowed out of the wildly divergent views and the hatreds and so forth, that passions that were aroused as people started to read more widely and engage in intellectual warfare that then often boiled into hot wars and murderous, intent. It's very sad that happened, but ultimately it led to an explosion of understanding and of learning. Yeah. And I am yet optimistic that if we can get through the dreadful misuse of social media and grow the quality side of social media and this new way of accessing information. I mean, I have a series of people that I love listening to and long form podcasts and what have you. I run one, as you know. I don't know that I love listening to my own, but a lot of people do, which I'm very, very thankful for. We've had well over 16 million YouTube downloads, plus I don't know how many podcasts. And we try to bring good thinking to the fore. And I'm really encouraged every time a young person pulls me up, and it happens much more often than I thought it would, in an airport or on the street or whatever. Hey, I was listening to you talk to X, or that yarn you had with so-and-so. I found that really helpful. And some of them actually say, for the first time, I heard some alternative views. So no easy answers. No. We just need to recognize the severity of the cultural war that we're in, the fact that we're on the back foot, and with patience, firmness, kindness, understanding, and a clarion call for thinking rather than feeling, be active in the debate wherever we can.
Yeah, perfect. John, I don't know if you've read a chap called Douglas Murray. He's an atheist.
Yep. Yeah.
And he wrote a book called The Strange Death of Europe.
Yeah.
But interestingly, in that, as an atheist, he said that he highlighted the fact that the debt Western civilization owes to Christianity is huge. How do you think this is reflected in our Australian history, John?
Well, it's enormous. All of our institutions essentially are modelled on the English one, and the English one, you know, the mother of parliaments and so forth, started with the Magna Carta, which was a profoundly Christian doctrine. It started with insisting on freedom of religion. In essence, we go back and look, we celebrated its whatever anniversary a couple of years ago, and I was amazed how few many commentators understood it was a deeply religious document. And it grew through that. You know, the great struggles in Britain to basically put in place a Christian worldview. What do I mean by that? It means that we see ourselves in the end as accountable to God and to our neighbour, not to kings, not to feudal overlords, not to those who have the power of the knife, the gun, the sword, whatever, but a much higher way of thinking, a worldview that said every individual's entitled to the vote. We will elect governments and remove them at the point of a pencil, not a gun. All of those things played out massively in Australia. Then there's a whole lot of history that's not understood, of course. If you look at the way in which the Prime Minister of the time chose an evangelical Christian, a naval man called Middleton, he was not the boss of the Navy. He was actually number 3 in the hierarchy, but he chose that man to set up the first fleet. And he wrote in his diary, Middleton wrote in his diary, this is wonderful, but firstly, we'll do it properly because our God's a God of order. And we ought to show that we do this to a high degree. So he went out and bought 11 ships. None of them were more than 5 years old. They were all young ships. Secondly, this is a great opportunity to rehabilitate the prisoners. We'll feed them properly. They've got the same rations on the ships out. All the ships made it because they weren't so old, as their guards did. And the officers did. They weighed more when they arrived in Sydney than when they left. Can you believe it? And thirdly, I know I want to be sensitive when I say this, but thirdly, we will seek this as a great opportunity. They didn't have the Enlightenment view of the Aboriginals, that they were noble savages. They had a higher view, the highest view of all. They are fully human like us, and this is our opportunity to reach them and do good. Now, I know that will be controversial, but credit for motivation. And then Australia turned from being a penal settlement into being a putative nation under the guidance, and I'm going to say of 2 people really, of Governor Lachlan Macquarie and his wife Elizabeth. They were profoundly faithful, and they believed that when a convict had done their time, they should be set free and welcomed back into society. They would have paid very dearly for that because so many people disagreed, but they established the principle and Australia started to grow as a nation. And part of what they did, by the way, the early governors all deserve credit for this. The convicts were a pretty rough bunch. A lot of kids being born out of wedlock, and everybody said the next generation will be even worse. They put an enormous emphasis on marriage. Convicts were encouraged to get married. And the kids became known as the currency lads and lasses. They surprised everybody. They turned out to be sturdy model citizens who built a nation. And the shortest answer as to why they disappointed the critics who said they'd be terrible, well, an amazing number of them, amazingly, grew up with a mother and a father who were married. And this is very inconvenient for people who have done so much to destroy the Christian model of marriage. But our forebears in this country saw its importance. And it goes on.
Yeah.
Even the AMP, you know, which came out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry, but it was set up by clergy and Christian businessmen. It became, in the words of its official historian, the most trusted institution in Australia after the Christian churches. You could trust the AMP with your buck. That's not how they came out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry. You know, there was a time when you did the right thing, whether you were coerced or not. There weren't many prudential arrangements when the AMP was set up. Then we had laws governing everybody's actions, and it still came a cropper.
Absolutely. John, interestingly, I've got a question here, and something you've alluded to is that this all seems to be predicated on the fact that we need to get our education system right. The national curriculum, which you've alluded to, I mean, we've had in there, as you know, people referred to Anzac Day as being contested. It didn't exist or whatever. Now there is a move, as you said, towards Western and Christian heritage. The question that somebody's reminded me of was that the Archbishop Justin Welby in the UK has written a book called Reimagining Britain. And in that book, he says that that Christian heritage is necessary to build the future foundation for a nation. Do you think that's possible, John, given this move to a secular society as we're witnessing now?
All things are possible for God. In human terms,
Amen.
I think it's impossible.
Yeah.
In human terms, I think it's impossible. But I won't name him, but I know one of the world's most famous atheists and a man of superb mind. And he says that the West was made great by Christianity. The West is in decline because it's deserted Christianity. Only a major Christian revival will save the West. I wish I could tell you who it is, but I can't. And so please don't speculate. I can't. It was a private comment. And I sort of gently responded. I thought to myself, now this is really interesting. So we were made great by something that's not true. We're in decline because we've abandoned something that's not true. And we can only recover if we go back to something that's not true. But, I mean, this is a great point. Really clear thinkers, and there are a lot of them about. I mean, Tom Hammond is another. He wrote the book Dominion.
Yes.
There are people everywhere who do not share. You mentioned Douglas Murray. Absolutely right. Clear thinkers who understand history can see that our culture was shaped by Christianity. And, there's a deeply spiritual element, I think, to the way in which it's now mocked. It's because essentially we as human beings don't like truth, particularly when it confronts us with a massive problem. In essence, the Christian message starts with, you are loved, but your selfishness is destroying the world. It used to be called sin. Let's just call it selfishness. Your self-obsession.
Yeah.
And it's worth remembering, that the story of the flood, the Bible tells us one of the reasons God did it was he was so sick of our violence towards one another. He's a God who hates violence, which is very important for us to remember. We must not respond to the intellectual and other forms of violence directed against us with violence.
John, I wonder if I can just change tack for a minute. I've read your book, very candid. I must say I had tears in my eyes at times. John, can you just take me through your faith during those awful times that you went through and your faith? Because I think it's a real message for everyone. I know it's a message for me, but could you take us through those periods where you were perhaps even struggling with your faith? I'm not sure, but it's a wonderful book and it's a personal level, but I wonder if you could share that with us at this point in time.
Greg, the book's long out of print, of course, and it's a biography, not an autobiography. And to tell you the truth, I've never really been able to read it because I promised myself when Paul, who's a very fine man, Paul Gallagher wanted to write it, that I'd just tell him as best I could my story. He could write it and put it out there, and I'd trust the Almighty for the rest. But look, what you're alluding to, I think, is that I became a believer after the tragic death of my sister. And I have been prepared to tell that story, particularly since I've seen young people, particularly young men, looking for grit and truth and raw, unvarnished reality from Jordan Peterson. They flock to hear him talk the truth. And I think they want to know how to find some meaning and purpose and what other people have been through. So I talk quite openly about the tragedy when my teenager was killed. I often say, when my sister was killed, when we were teenagers, because it was an accidental death, but I was the creator of the accident, if I can put it that way. You go to a place where almost no one else has been, and even though they try and understand, and people did, and they were very good to me, my childhood ended instantly, and I went to a place which required deep thinking. So only as I look back, I realized that there were three essential problems. To describe them as a triangle, first is, why suffering? And why me? Well, suffering, I think the only rational explanation is to say it's because the world is broken, and the biblical account of why it's broken, our selfishness, our rejection of the God who loved us and set certain parameters and saying, no, I'll be boss over my life, has broken everything. Still doesn't answer the question of why me. I don't know that I'll ever know that, but at least it's a reasonable explanation for why evil exists. It's far better than saying it's all just an accident. It's all just an accident. Why do I care? Why do I feel? Why does it hurt? Secondly, does anybody out there understand? Does anybody care? Well, hang on, that's the story of the cross. Yes, he understands because he was unjustly tried, perfectly innocent, subjected to the worst injustices in terms of his trial any human being could ever be, and then put to the most awful death ever. So yeah, he understands. Does he care? Yes, he must have, because he went through with it for me and for you. Third part of the triangle, does the pain end? Will the wars end? Will the wounds be bound up? Well, yes, that's the promise. I go to prepare a place for you where all will be restored. And to be perfectly bluntly selfish for a moment, I'd hate to miss out on that point one. Point two, quite frankly, is I'd kind of like to be the person that I think I ought to be. I know I'm not now, but I'd like to be the person I ought to be.
Wonderful. And I must tell you, another book that brought tears to my eyes was a book by Tony McClellan. I don't know if you've read it, Jumble Plains. He's a wonderful man, and that's another one that really is a story of how one becomes a Christian in the corporate sector. The question I have for you, John, is you're a Christian, you're a politician. I remember when we were working in Parliament House, when Parliament House, I used to go to the parliamentary prayer breakfast, and I saw you there, John, and some others as well. John, how do you reconcile politics, church and state? What should a Christian in politics be doing? Should he or she be denying that faith or not expressing it? Or how do you think Christians, if we're going to make Western civilization prominent again, I think we need to have more Christians in politics. Comments on that for me, John?
Yeah, look, it's not easy, and I think I'm sure I failed many times. My prayer used to be, Lord, drum me out of the place rather than let me disgrace the gospel. And let's be frank about this. You and I have both seen Christians behave at times with terrible hypocrisy. I worry that I may have myself at times, and I still do. So there's no room for any pride in this, but you can't renounce your faith. You must never do that. How would we stand before the Lord one day and have him say, well, you renounced me. Why would I acknowledge you? And I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's easy at all. And I think every Christian who goes into it ought to be prepared to do two things. The first is to say, I must not disown my faith. I must be simply open and accountable. It doesn't mean you go out there, make the mistake of trying to rub people's noses in it. I try to adopt the approach of simply quietly being a believer and letting people ask questions. And it slowly built an awareness, I suppose, of my faith. But I did try very hard not to disown it. Secondly, though, I think here's this point. We shouldn't give up because we don't win when we put our case. God doesn't give up on us as people when we don't always do what he would like us to do. So when you lose a debate or it goes against you in the parliament, there's no excuse for walking away. Essentially, I think the answer is to get up and have another go. However, that comes with a massive proviso. Everyone should be prepared to say that if my conscience is pricked to the point where I don't think I can do my job with integrity anymore, or this issue is so profound that I simply have to make a point, that point, your faith should clearly come before your political or personal or financial ambitions.
John, just sticking with that theme, and I'm hoping you can comment. Our Prime Minister is a Christian. How do you think he is being perceived by the Christian community? We don't have a religious discrimination bill now. That's been pulled, which was pledged. How does a Christian then front up to Christians and say, look, I've failed you, or I couldn't do this, or whatever the case may be? How do you think our Prime Minister, and you know him well, or how does anybody handle that sort of situation when they have to give an account of their failures or their misgivings or whatever, John?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, can I say this? I think one thing that really needs to be said in Scott and his family's defence is that they have at all times, even when under the most vicious attack, not retorted in kind. And I think he has carried himself with very real dignity and decency, given the absolute venom that many people ought to be utterly ashamed of themselves for throwing at him. And I say that with some passion.
Agree.
There are too many commentators and too many Australians that need to have a darned hard look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves what sort of people they are before they make some of the trite criticisms that they have of the Prime Minister. So I want to make that very plain to put it in some perspective. The concern I have over the religious freedom. I mean, here's the amazing thing that people don't realise. The great bulk of the parliament, the great bulk, including the Labor Party, we're in favour. And we're voting for the religious discrimination legislation. That's forgotten. The media haven't pointed it out. There was, unfortunately, an attempt to drag a complete red herring. I'm not saying the issue's not important, but it did not have to do with the Religious Discrimination Act. It was a completely separate matter that related to a section of the Sexual Discrimination Act and schools and their right to determine who will be students. It was so ill thought out that the whole thing had to be pulled because the results of excluding or lifting that part of Labor's legislation would have been to have put parents in a position, for example, where if they had to send, I mean, I live in a fairly remote part of the country, had to go to boarding school. I mean, how would my parents have felt? How would the listeners have felt? How would the average Australian have felt? This legislation could have resulted in common dormitories, common bathrooms, in boarding school situations, or, I mean, it hadn't been thought through.
No.
And so my concern is that it was left very late in the piece. When there was evidently a willingness to pass the Religious Discrimination Act. Hey, media, how about telling the Australian people that? And that the bit of the Sex Discrimination Act that people wanted to have a look at, and the Prime Minister said be looked at again, should have gone to the Law Reform Commission and been carefully considered, because frankly, there's a whole lot of parliamentarians who have got egg all over the face. They did not understand what it was that they were proposing to do, Greg. You've worked in the place. It is a very poor reflection on the Australian Parliament.
Totally
There's
agree.
no other way of putting it.
It was hijacked again by, I guess, the media and the ideology of the left. John, I totally agree. A very quick question, and then we might sort of wrap up. John, Ukraine. Now, it's a situation that, of course, impacts every one of us. How do you see it from your perspective as a politician, ex-politician, as a Christian, as a commentator? John, can you just share your thoughts with us on Ukraine?
Well, very briefly, I think the West wears quite a bit of the culpability for this. We smugly assumed democracy had won when the Berlin Wall came down in 1990 or so. We should have known that no such thing was ever going to happen. So, but we started to wind back our defence budgets. We started to divided and weakened, didn't believe in our own culture. I think in some ways we frankly poked the Russian bear in unwise ways. That is not in any way to excuse the unbelievably evil behaviour of the Russian president. It is not. But it is to say that I think we took our eye off the ball very badly. Now we have the mother of all wake-up calls, the coming together of China and Russia, a new insistence that they know how to run the world better than the decadent West. Well, I'm going to be blunt and say in many ways we have been pretty decadent. We do need to wake up. We need to change course. We need to ask ourselves, are we so selfish that we just want to live our lives in comfort and not worry about what we're passing on to our kids and our grandkids, that our forebears fought so hard for in this country? Anzac Day is coming up. Are we worthy inheritors of the legacy that the Anzacs left to us? Ponder this for a moment. Little nation of 5.5 million people in 1905 thought there's trouble brewing. They didn't know what it was going to be like, but they were alert. And they went to the British, said, we want a navy. And then Brits said, oh, you can't have a navy. You might go adventuring with it. No, we want a navy. We're going to pay for it. And the Brits gave way. And 5 years after we order it, 5 years, how long have we taken to sort out submarines in this country? 5 years after they ordered it, brand new navy sailed through Sydney Heads. And a year later, war broke out and Australia was able to secure the Southwest Pacific and the Anzacs sailed freely from a secured homeland. Now, what's the matter with us? We're 25 million people now. We spent the last 10 years ignoring the warning signs, not getting our act together. And Europe's been the same. But here's a greatly encouraging thing. Germany, which had become, I think, pathetically pacifist and unrealistic. And I'm afraid Angela Merkel will go down in history less than Rosalie, if I can use some very poorly constructed English, because, building a dependence on Russia for energy, winding back your defense forces. Now the Germans are suddenly saying, whoa, we've got this wrong. They're prepared to wear a lot of pain now, and they're wearing a lot of pain, and we're going to double defense expenditure. By the way, just coming up to the next elections in these dangerous times, the spotlight in this country needs to be turned squarely on the Greens. I'd like to know how thinking Australians could vote for a party who says the ideal defence model is the New Zealand one. We ought to halve our defence expenditure, take it back to 1%, turn it into a peacekeeping force, because that is what the Greens have said. That's what their leader has said. It's the gold standard that Australia should adopt. I hope Australians will stop and think before they risk the Greens having any power in the next Parliament.
Amen. John, let me just quickly then finish off and share this with you, because you've mentioned the elections, and what I'd like to do is just show you that our next webinar, John, will be on how in God's name should I vote? And we've got some interesting politicians here that you will know. So I'm encouraging everybody to join us on Tuesday, March 22nd. We've got Senator Deborah O'Neill, Bob Catter, Senator Pauline Hanson and George Christensen. And these people are going to sort of tell us how in their view, the election will end up. But I'm sure, John, you'll have some interesting thoughts on that. John, may I just please, if I could, close in prayer, and then we'll call it a night. Would that be okay, John?
Of course.
Thank you. Lord God, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the work that John is doing in the public arena. Thank you so much, Heavenly Father, that we can share his thoughts with everybody else that has tuned in tonight. But more importantly, Lord, thank you that we are able to glorify you, whether it's in politics, whether it's in the corporate sector, or whether it's just at home. We thank you, and we do ask you to continue to allow John to further the gospel through the work that he does. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. John, thank you very much on behalf of our governing board, our supporters. I've really enjoyed that. Thank you once again, and good night to all the people that have joined in tonight. Good night, everybody, and thank you, John.
Thank you. Thanks all. I appreciate the chance.